Hello everyone, and welcome to Grantek Systems Integration's latest webinar in our Beyond Compliance series. My name is Sam Russem, and our topic today is the top 3 benefits of digital track and trace and MES solutions. Thank you for taking the time to join us, and I hope you enjoy our presentation today. As I mentioned, my name is Sam Russem, and I'm the Director of the Smart Manufacturing Practice at Grantek. We're one of Grantek's strategic initiatives, which are groups that we form to tackle topics that we feel are going to be valuable to our customers, but go beyond some of the things like PLC programming and panel design you're going to find at most other systems integrators. We do have more information on Grantek at the end of this deck. I personally have been at Grantek for 9 years as of this summer, over 6 of which have been focused in smart manufacturing space, as an engineer, consultant, project manager, and team lead. I've been specializing in digital systems and data collection to improve processes and quality. A quick note on questions before we begin. On all of the subsequent slides, I'm going to have my email address listed at the top of the screen for all these slides going forward, and we do have time allocated for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions that you want me to hear answered during the broadcast, I'm happy to do so. Just send them to me in an email, and we'll try to get to those answers on the air. Or if you think of something later and you want to follow up with me for any other reason, please don't hesitate to reach out. As I had mentioned, the Smart Manufacturing Practice is one of Grantek's strategic initiatives. Our other strategic initiatives include the Safety Practice and IT/OT Cybersecurity. Hopefully some of you have been to some of their recent webinars in the Beyond Compliance series as well. All of the strategic initiatives have a core playbook centered around the ideas of educate, assess, and design. Education is around training both internally and for our customers around industry standards and trends in each of our specific areas, hence our broadcast today. The next stage is assessments, working with customers to gather requirements and determine how to best approach an opportunity or problem. And then design, developing architectures and plans for how to get to from point A to point B based on the needs that we've identified. As for today's goals and agenda, we're going to start with understanding the principles of track and trace. Just some high-level discussion to make sure that we all have the same frame of reference. While our focus today is on things beyond compliance, we are going to talk about compliance a little bit. It's just one slide, I promise, and then we'll get to more of the things beyond compliance. The next 2 topics I'm actually going to be mixing up a little bit. We're going to be going through a digital track and trace system and building that up for a virtual plant, demonstrating specific needs and how we can address them as we build our virtual plants. Now, the vision here is going to be for a digital track and trace system. We'll discuss how track and trace often starts as a manual process, but our focus today is building that into more of a digital computer-based system and the benefits that you get from doing so. And then we're also going to make sure that we're talking about the advantages of this system beyond compliance. Compliance and regulations are things that you need to do and should already be doing. So we're going to be focusing on unlocking that next layer of capabilities and how the other advantages that you can get through a well-designed computerized track and trace system. To wrap it up, we're going to talk a little bit more about MES from a high level and how Grantek approaches MES projects like track and trace before we open it up for questions. So let's start with those principles of a track and trace system. And let's keep it pretty simple by just first defining each of those terms in the context of what we're talking about here. So tracking is the process of actually collecting unique identifier and product transformation data throughout the production process. Whereas tracing is about using that tracked data to establish product genealogy information and understand everything that went into building a product. Now, notice that I emphasize the difference between data and information. We're leaning on the idea here that data is raw and typically unusable in the form that it comes in, whereas information is data that has been processed by an expert system or expert individual and turned into something that is usable so that people can act on it. A lot of the ideas of track and trace are also built on the ISA 95 concepts of things like equipment models, resources, and process segments, where a process segment is pretty much any task that can be done during manufacturing. So you'll hear me mention things like process segments or resources as we go through the rest of the presentation. Track and trace systems are generally built on this concept of receiving a production response for each production segment. Again, where a segment is each thing that you do in the process. Typically, those responses that we're going to get, those data packets, are going to include things like what was actually produced, including any relevant batch or lot numbers, what was actually consumed, again, including those batch and lot numbers, the equipment that was used, personnel that was involved in the process, and other significant production data you're going to need. Temperatures or pressures, for example, are pretty common ones we'll see. And we see a quick little mock-up on the side here of a track and trace data view that we for a certain software suites. So on the next slide, let's take a quick look at this virtual plant that we're going to be building today as our example. We're going to be really basic in principle here, and we're going to talk about just making some chocolate chip cookies. First, we have our set of raw ingredients, which are going to get mixed into a dough. Then we have a forming and baking section before product is packaged and shipped out the door. We're also going to assume at a minimum that we do have some tracking data that we're collecting from the line today. For example, maybe we have an operator in the mixing area that's writing out a manual batch report. So they would be writing things like the raw ingredients that they use and what lots those came from, recipe parameters that were entered into the mixer, as well as some metadata like the date, time, operator, the line they're using, things like that. We're also going to assume that we have somebody over in the packaging area who's filling out a production report. This reports more details around things like work order fulfillments and tracking from batch to package to pallet, and also contains similar metadata. Now, one of the important things here is where these reports go once they're actually filled out. So in one case, we might have these paper reports that are stored in a filing cabinet and then put into an office. And then it's more often than not, this data is manually entered into the most powerful program in the world, Microsoft Excel or Access, which you could argue is a digital system in one way, but we're talking about more automated and advanced systems here. So let's chat a little bit about compliance. This is the one slide, I promise this one's it. So in pharmaceuticals, when we talk about track and trace and as they relate to compliance, we're talking about serialization. Serialization is a part of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, and it requires that all packages have a standardized, unique identifier with traceability and product verification throughout. On the food and beverage side, for example, the law of the land is FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, the FSMA is more speaking to the traceability around ingredients, what goes into a batch, and potential allergens. And there's a heavy focus on recalls. The ability to respond to potential allergens or recalls need to happen in an efficient way. Now, notice that both of these compliance measures are focused on traceability and genealogy. They really focus on the results of being able to trace a product, and they are not as much concerned about the actual tracking piece of this. As long as you're getting the data and it is accurate, it's verifiable, they are much more worried about the tracing part of track and trace. Also notice that we have accomplished a lot of the traceability goals in the manual data collection path that we just showed. It's not the easiest way to do it, but you could go through and you could have unique identifiers that are properly documented, and you could be following through lots and addressing recalls as needed. So that's why these usually start off as these manual processes. You do need to have them in your plans for compliance, but there's definitely some shortcomings, and there's a lot of opportunities to grow if we're looking towards a more digital solution. So let's take our plan from the previous slide and expand on that a little bit, because most of us don't just have a single path through our plants. Things are going to get a little bit more complicated. We're going to have multiple mixers, multiple ovens, multiple packaging areas, and the relationships could be one-to-one, many-to-one, or one-to-many. So the question becomes, what do we do with these people now? So before, where we just had a single person writing out a batch report, and a single person doing a work order fulfillment report, that was pretty manageable. But now do we need to have different people filling out different reports for each line? Do we have individual people running around to all of the lines themselves and collecting that data? Things can get pretty complicated pretty fast. The burden of tracking just got a lot more significant. The other thing that you may have noticed in the previous slide I had was that there was no manual reporting over in the ovens area. Usually products just passing through those, and it might not be as manned as some of the other operations that you have. It's not uncommon to see black holes in your data that are created from expanding capacity over time. So this is actually going to bring us to our first digital advantage: tracking, effort, and accuracy. So having people run across your line and collecting data for tracking purposes is not high value work. You want to be able to free up that human capital to do more value add tasks. People should be acting on the information that's made available to them instead of having to collect the data to make the information. And when you're collecting that tracking data automatically, it is faster, easier, and more reliable. Even if you're directly entering that into an MES and there is still manual interactions into the system, it's going to be better in a digitized computer system than it is through a lot of the issues that can come up through a paper-based one. So what does this look like in our virtual plants? First, we're going to add a couple of new components in here. We're going to have an ERP system, which is going to be used for tracking raw ingredients and managing work orders. And we're also going to have our MES system with the track and trace component installed. We're not going to go into the details of how all of this works today. We're more talking about the advantages that you could theoretically get based on your business needs through implementing such a system. So we're also going to assume that a lot of the equipment that we have on the line is able to be put on the network and provide the data that we need for tracking to our MES system. So these red lines are representing the data from each of these machines being collected for traceability. Now, there's a couple of exceptions that we're also going to want to put in. One is around the idea of some manual scanning of lots and raw ingredients. It's very much not uncommon for us to see people who are scanning these lots manually with barcode scanners and entering that data into an ERP system or into track and trace manually. There's also opportunities for some new technologies. For example, RFID in the packaging area is very common. Not going to be particularly advantageous to our system where we just have a black box that is packaging, but certainly if you have a lot of work in progress through your packaging lines and a place where you can put that RFID label, it is one of the most popular ways to be tracking product through a packaging process. So now we're collecting all of our data automatically from each of these and collecting, and the burden on our operators has been reduced significantly. Let's talk about some of the before and after cases here. Before, we had a very heavy reliance on manpower to collect data. We had a lot of paper, which has a higher risk of having inaccurate data, or frankly, just losing that paper and therefore losing your tracking information. We had problems with black holes, or there were pieces of our process that were not automated and not a part of our tracking system, and we have people spending a lot of time collecting the data that's necessary. Afterwards, we have very limited operator interaction. We can collect more thorough data from more pieces of our process, and now we've freed up our people's time to add value back into the products that we're making. So now that we've looked at some of the benefits of collecting data digitally, let's focus on the other side of the coin. So turning that data into information and looking at tracing and genealogy. This brings us to our second digital advantage: tracing efficiently and with versatility. Once we have all this data into our track and trace system, traceability all of a sudden can be done in minutes with mouse clicks, as opposed to hours or days of individuals sifting through paper forms to put together the map of how a product was made. You also have a lot more flexibility in how you trace with these quick reports. Do we want to see all of the ingredient lots that went into a cookie? Or do we want to take a specific cookie and see all of the, do we want to see all of the cookies that may have been made from a specific material lot? Or do we want to do this from an equipment perspective and take a specific mixing line or a cooking line that we had and determine all of the products that went through that? Now that we have all this, tracing is starting to become a tool in our tool belt and not some labor-intensive exercise that you only do when you have to for some compliance reason. Let's apply this to our digital plant too. So we still have our red tracking data on here, red tracking arrows on here, and now we're going to add some new ones. We're going to start with backwards traceability. I have a box of cookies, and I need to trace that back through our process. With a couple of mouse clicks, that's all of a sudden going to be very easy. I can see exactly which packaging line, which oven, and which mixer a certain batch of cookies came from. I can also trace it all the way back to the specific raw ingredient lots that may have gone into that cookie. We also get some forward traceability. If I wanted to take sugar lot 345 and see all of the cookies that were made from that, I can trace from that lot out to not only this batch of cookies, but any other batch of cookies that may have gone through the door. We also do get some middle out traceability. Scenario being, let's say that we have a batch of burnt cookies, and we put that through the genealogy system and realize that we actually have a couple of issues where burnt cookies are coming through a specific oven line, and I'm able to send a tech out to check that out and see what might be what kind of maintenance might be required for that specific oven. So a lot of this is just definitely is material and information that is inherent in a traceability system. Theoretically, if you had the time, you could do this with a lot of the track and trace data that you may already be collecting. So let's turn around again and focus on the digital advantage of this. While you could do a lot of this before, it could be very labor intensive. And if it does take you hours or days to put together the genealogy of a product, you're only going to do that trace when you absolutely have to. And you're going to be limited generally in what you need to do for compliance reasons. However, if we have the digital system and the speed advantages that come with that, we get to use this information for things beyond compliance. We're collecting data on a minute to second timescale, and it can become a tool for us to dive into more deep questions about our production line. So beyond tracking and tracing and the efficiencies that come with each of those, let's talk about our third and final digital advantage for today. Information in context with MES. So imagine now that beyond just our track and trace system, we have other elements of a layer 3 MES system in place. Not only can that information be put into the context of track and trace data, but you can put track and trace data in the context of that other information as well. So we can now put in immediate associations to things like quality checks that were performed, recipes that were used and if they may have changed, equipment performance and OEE, and all operator interactions throughout the process. To bring it back to our virtual plants, let's add in some of these capabilities one by one. Let's say that we do have recipe management, and we're going to apply that to all of our mixing lines. We're also going to be implementing some quality management in MES and having operators at certain areas be doing quality checks or automatic quality checks being done throughout the line. And finally, OEE and performance management. We're going to install that over on our packaging lines and provide that data to the MES as well. There's real advantages to having all of this come back to a common platform in our MES system. All this data becomes cross-relational, and it becomes very easy to pull one set of data and compare it to another. Let's work through an example of this. Our QA team has identified the greatest batch of cookies that they have ever seen. So they only have the end product though. So their first step is to trace that genealogy and figure out which pieces of equipment were responsible for making this ideal set of cookies. They can ask questions about what operator was working on the lines and what recipes did they run. Did they tweak this recipe? Is there something that they know about how to make these cookies that could be applied elsewhere? And then how did our line perform on the time? How did our line perform at the time? Does making this particular batch of cookies under these parameters lead to certain advantages in other parts of our project, or is it even more time consuming? Outside of a specific case study like that, it can be really useful to think about how a full MES implementation can affect your workflow. So you would have things like work orders automatically coming down from your ERP system and inventory being counted against it, tracking recipes and actual consumption values automatically, quality checks that are seamlessly integrated with other data. You would know how your line runs, when it's going down and why, and you know who operates the line and what they're doing. Once you think about all of that context, all of the data that you have and the fact that it's all in a central repository, you can see how powerful combining a lot of these pieces of information can become. So, like the sections before it, let's go back and do a before and after look at our digital advantage. So for information in context with MES, before you may have had some of this information, but they were all in silos. So track and trace data can really only be used for track and trace, and any combinations of this data has to be done very manually. Afterwards, though, you can consider data across MES management areas and provide more data within the context of track and trace, and more track and trace data in the context of other MES principles. So we've spoken quite a bit about MES. I do want to talk a little bit about the other aspects of an MES system and how Grantek approaches them. As you can see in one of the ISA 95 models examples I have on the right, track and trace is often a piece of your MES system, which is a level 3 system. If you're not familiar, a quick review around some of these levels is that level 0 is typically around your process, so your direct sensors and hardware. Level 1 is your controls and PLC. Level 2 is your SCADA systems. Level 4 is your ERP, your SAP, and your order management. And level 3 is the thing that ties your automation systems at the plant back up into your ERP systems. The time scale of a lot of this data can change as you go up in certain levels. So oftentimes you do want to see track and trace in your level 3 data, where it's not concerned about things like sub-second resolution data. But it's also a lot more refined than what we have up in our ERP systems, which could be on the scale of days and weeks or quarters, and is much more tied to your financial information. Grantek relies on a standards-based approach as we come into MES projects. We always like to begin with an assessment of the business value and what our customers are trying to realize out of an MES system. This includes reviews of people, processes, and technology to establish that business case. We'll work to link measurable business value to the improvements that we want to make into a system, and we'll follow our standards-based approach to identify and define the required capabilities. Then we'll work with our users once we understand what we're trying to build and why we're trying to build it, then we'll work to select a platform to consider the overall needs of the MES process. Another way of looking at that process overview is shown on the chart here, where we typically start with a discovery and envisioning workshop to review what it is you have today in terms of your people, your KPIs, and your general infrastructure, and where it is that you want to go. With those two, we're able to develop a roadmap to show the gaps of where you are and where you need to be, as well as a user requirement specification to define the business values that you're trying to drive out of this system. We'll often do a vendor fit and gap analysis to figure out software out there and what is best going to suit your needs. And then we'll design the system. So both doing the documentation and the templates and the testing protocols that are going to be required to validate the system once it's been built. Finally, we select a line or two for a pilot before doing a full rollout to multiple sites. So in summary, we're going to talk about track and trace, where track is collecting that unique identifier information and data, and tracing is producing genealogy information. We talked about how the top 3 benefits of these digital track and trace MES systems can be around the effort and accuracy of tracking, the efficiency and versatility of tracing, and then the power of track and trace information in context with the rest of your MES system. So I hope you found that all useful and enjoyable. A couple of slides on Grantek before I open it up for questions. Grantek is a systems integrator and solutions provider, where we specialize in manufacturing automation solutions, manufacturing IT solutions, industrial safety solutions, and smart manufacturing and consulting services. Grantek is growing and has been for some time, with many of our latest offices in San Francisco and Fort Lauderdale, and now Inland Empire, California, being built just in the past few years. Here's a quick visual representation of a number of our brick and mortar offices, as well as our satellite offices that we use to increase our reach across the United States and Canada. Grantek likes to focus on tie all of the work we do back into a concept of operational excellence and making sure that all the work that we do is value add to our customers. I also wanted to list a number of our key partners and certifications. If we're talking about MES systems and track and trace systems, you'll notice that a lot of the partners that we have in here support the ideas of track and trace, have software that may have a track and trace MES components, or can be providing data that is absolutely crucial to these track and trace systems. In the upper left, you'll see Mesa International is one of our main partners and certifications. If you're not familiar with Mesa, I highly recommend that you look them up. A lot of the information that we use to build our MES best practices are things that we have worked with this group to establish and things that have been inspired by their best practices. My email address is at the top of the screen, so if you do have anything that you would like to follow up with us on, I definitely will eagerly await your email, and we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can. Otherwise, thank you all very much.